Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, I am joined by author Sean Manseau, and we discuss his book, AP Psychedelics, Going Beyond Set and Setting to Achieve Visionary Virtuosity. But the episode is going with the title, The First Church of David Bowie's Shamanic Cabaret, which will all become clear throughout the course of our conversation. We spoke a couple of months ago, so this is not exactly fresh in terms of putting it out, but of course it will be fresh for you if you've never read his book, and if these are all new ideas for you. And it's basically about taking very large doses of mushrooms and performing in a theater troupe for an audience. And we'll get to it. It's a lot of fun. I think you'll find it quite interesting. I certainly did. Don't really have any announcements this week. I don't have anybody to thank for making a contribution or joining on as a supporter over at Patreon over this past week. So unfortunately, I don't have any names to mention there. But of course, if you would like to support this podcast or join up as a patron over at Patreon, you can go to my personal webpage, martinball.net, use either the PayPal or the Patreon link at the top right of the page, and you can make a contribution or join up as a supporter over at Patreon and get the benefits and gifts that go with that. And of course, my Patreon page is patreon.com/martinwball. And as always, I am available for 30, 60, and 90-minute consultations to help you sort through your stuff. You can check it out at non-dual-entheogenicintegration.com if you want more information, or just shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com. And yeah, those are all the very many announcements that I have for today. So let's go ahead and get into this conversation with Sean Manseau. It's a nice, long, juicy conversation. So sit back, relax, maybe throw on a little David Bowie just to get in the mood. And here's my conversation with Sean. Hope you enjoy. Cool. Well, Sean, I'm excited to talk to you about your book today, AP Psychedelics, Going Beyond Set and Setting to Achieve Visionary Virtuosity. And I gotta say, it is quite an interesting read. I've never really read anything like this in regards to psychedelics. I'm just curious with the title, AP, is that like advanced placement? Or
No, that's exactly what it is.
All right.
That's exactly what it is. I mean, and it's sort of designed to look like a textbook, even though it's not. You know, it's really sort of a pseudo memoir. The book that might be the closest comparison would be Carlos Castaneda's first book, except that I am sort of upfront about I'm not claiming any spurious sort of background or heritage for this. You know what I mean? But in the sense of it being an account of a first person exploration. And trying to get across some ideas of a new approach, or possibly a new approach.
Well, it seems like a new approach to me. I mean, I haven't read anything like this, and the description of what it is that you're describing here in this book is just like, wow, this is something totally, completely different. And so now we're teasing the audience with how different it is. But your book gets into what you call the phonomantic method, and we have things like the Anne Frank playlist and the Transcendental Disco, and this is all couched within the First Church of David Bowie's Shamanic Cabaret. So that should be enough of a teaser to get people interested, like, what the hell is this about? But I also get the impression from reading the book that this is something that you've developed over the last few years, that it doesn't go back that long, so it's still maybe kind of even relatively new for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, this started about 5 years ago. I've had psychedelic experiences going all the way back to college. I actually wrote my my undergrad honors thesis based on an LSD experience that I had that produced what I would call an ontological revelation. And then I didn't do anything with it for years and years, except for dabbling in Jungian analysis and stuff like that. And then in 2016, I started working with an ayahuasca group outside of Seattle, and then that inadvertently precipitated the work that I ended up doing with psilocybin mushrooms and harmaline and all the rest of the stuff that I use.
Would that by chance have been a Santo Daime point?
No, the group that I was working with in outside of Seattle was led by a guy who had apprenticed with a Shipibo Indian down in Peru, and by all accounts, he was very much a traditionalist and ran a very tight ship, like in that tradition.
Yeah.
In the Maloka, in the dark, in silence, except for all the retching and the screaming and the vomiting and
Yeah.
everything. But
did they not do Icaros?
they did, but we didn't sing with them.
Right. Okay.
They sang fantastic Icaros, yeah. And with little instrumentation or anything, it was very traditional.
Okay. Well, I just asked if perhaps it was Santo Daime because, of course, they are active on the West Coast. And there were some elements of what you're describing here that kind of reminded me of Santo Daime where, you've got to do these, everybody's singing, everybody's dancing. So there is kind of like a ritual structure performance, but certainly not anything at the level of what it is that you're describing here.
Yeah.
In
Well,
your book.
there's that. I don't know if you remember. There's a passage in the book where it says something to the effect that there is a historical precedent, which is Santo Daime for this in terms of like these group things. And the cliche thing would be to claim that the phonemantic method and entheotainments are Santo Daime on steroids, but it's not. It's Santo Daime on the gamma bomb explosion that created the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah, and perhaps even kind of dipping back into early history, it very well possibly could be in alignment with what we had in the ancient mystery cults, where there were ritual performances and ritual consumption of, say, the kykeon or whatever Eucharist or sacrament that was being used, but it was couched within the context of performative ritual structures, where people are participating and going through these kind of acting out of these archetypal passages with the idea that you are generating the same experience within yourself as you go through the acting of it.
Yeah, I very much see it that way. It does seem to be a return of that sort of mystery tradition, which wasn't really planned that way. It's just how it ended up working out,
Yeah, and that was actually, you just mentioned one of the words that I meant to write down. I wrote down a little list of just little key phrases to mention, and entheotainment is one of them. So maybe, well, actually, I am curious at asking you about the report that you said that you did back in school about LSD and the ontological revelation. Maybe we can start there, and then let's get into the discussion of what is entheotainment and the phonomantic method, and then we'll get into everything that you're describing in your book. But I'm curious to hear about what you did as an undergrad and how you incorporated your LSD experience into your degree.
Sure. Well, like a lot of college kids, I experimented with psychedelics. Took them recreationally with my friends. They weren't easy to come by in the early '90s. Once in a while some mushrooms would show up or whatever. And I had done LSD a couple times on Blotter, and then this one night somebody found some LSD and it was really cheap. It was like $2 a hit, and so thinking that meant it was going to be week, I took 2 and that turned out to be a terrible mistake. And it started coming on really strong, and I asked a friend of mine. I got scared, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to be in public in the condition that I felt was coming on. And so I went back to my dorm room, and my friend came with me. And luckily for me, he was a journalism major and took notes on everything that I was saying for the rest of the evening, and that allowed me to reconstruct the experience later. But it was built around this a kaleidoscope that a friend had just given me recently for my birthday, like one of these really fancy kaleidoscopes. And I was looking through it, and I started to get these ideas as I was looking through it. And I actually happened to have this passage. An idea came unbidden. Perfection contemplates itself. Another interior image formed, more amorphous than the last. Unbounded reality, all that is, dividing in upon itself, circles within circles, enfolding until it was so fragile and exquisite that it was unbearable to contemplate. Reality was gradated. Each new level implied a different conscious perspective, and I was drawn through them. And so I ended up going through this, a whole visionary thing that ended up culminating in a sort of the quote unquote ego death, and what I wrote at the time, as I described as the hum of the eternal machine, And a year later, when I was reading Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, he described the sound Om as the vibration of the cosmic motor, and the parallel between those two really struck me, you know. But anyway, I wrote up like a 1 or 2 page description of this experience and brought it to a professor that I had met at UMass who described himself in seminars a mystic, and he pointed me towards Aldous Huxley's the Perennial Philosophy and Evelyn Underhill's Mysticism, and had me get started reading in those books, and especially through Huxley, I became aware of this idea of the Perennial Philosophy, and then the idea of emanationism, the philosophy of emanationism, and to quote Plotinus, all things are derived from the first reality or perfect God by steps of degradation to lesser degrees of the first reality or God. And at every step, the emanating beings are less pure, less perfect, less divine. And so I was really shocked to find that I felt I had spontaneously had a sort of direct intuition of this idea of emanationism. And that I started thinking about that a lot. And right around that time was when James Glick's book Chaos, I forget what the subtitle is, but it was this very popular science book in the early 90s about chaos theory and fractal mathematics.
Yeah. And
one of the ideas in in chaos is that when you graph the behavior of certain kinds of chaotic systems, it's fractal in nature, meaning it's self-similar across scales. You know what I mean? It's the same thing, but on a different. Like if you look at a Mandelbrot set and zoom in on the perimeter of it, you'll see another tiny little Mandelbrot set, and then another tiny little Mandelbrot set, and then et cetera, et cetera. And so, based off of that, and I hope I'm not jumping around too much, and then some ideas I encountered in Ken Wilber, especially the way he had applied Pierre Genet's childhood development schema to the model of consciousness described by mystics around the world. I got this idea that maybe that this idea of repetition in levels was the result of a sort of a fractal, could basically be described fractally, which meant that the same kinds of nonlinear systems that produced coastlines and stuff like that also produce consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and I'm reaching back across. I haven't really thought about any of that stuff in 30 years. That was what the sort of the gist of my honors thesis was about.
Yeah, but it actually reminds me of the subtitle to my 2009 book, Being Human, and the subtitle is An Entheological Guide to God, Evolution, and the Fractal Energetic Nature of Reality. It's kind of running on the same theme, and it's interesting that I think. I'm not a scholar of ancient Greece, so I don't know if people have really decided on what the kaikion really is at this point, or if we're still kind of up in the air about that. But it's certainly not surprising that someone in the modern age tripping on LSD might come up with the same ideas as people were generating back in ancient Greece if they really were, taking entheogens and then using that to structure their sense of philosophy and mathematics and geometric structure and, emanation of how reality functions as a phenomenon. It should actually point back in the same direction. So I'm curious that, kind of going through this sort of Gnostic revelation, and that's also something that we can talk about, this idea of what gnosis means, because this plays a role in your book. But I'm curious, just why did you not go on to graduate school? It sounds like you were kind of on a hot topic that you could have really gone deep into that in graduate school, though, it's hard to find a place that I want to do psychedelic philosophy.
Yeah. Well, that was the thing. So as an undergrad, I mean, I started taking classes in religion at UMass was it was a state university, so there wasn't that much in the way of actual religion classes. I had to go to Smith and Amherst and Mount Holyoke for those classes. But what I quickly realized was that I was thinking that if this stuff was real, if the revelations that I had were real, this was the most important topic in the world. And yet for the people I was taking classes with, studying the sacred text was basically like a comparative literature class for most of them. Mm-hmm. And they got angry if you tried to compare an idea of theosis in Eastern Rite Christianity with Samadi. You know what I mean? Because they're in different categories. You know what I mean? Like you were sort of overreaching by doing that, and I did not want to reduce that stuff to comparative literature, and so I decided not to pursue it at an academic level.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of my time as a student as well, that, I got interested in philosophy and then I got interested in Eastern philosophy, but was really frustrated that I couldn't go to a philosophy class and study Eastern philosophy. I had to go into religious studies, and there they wouldn't call it philosophy. And my philosophy professors would tell me, well, really only Western culture has philosophy and everybody else just has belief in religion. And I never bought that divide. And then as a
Mm-hmm.
graduate student, I went with the express interest in studying Buddhist philosophy, but then kind of got sucked into Native American cultures and studies, and, so divergent pathways. But it's interesting how it's kind of delineated within academics, and where cross dialogues are either allowed to happen at, really the exchange of ideas or the comparison of ideas, or, as you say, just sort of comparative literature is like, well, they say this and they say this, but without looking at, well, maybe are they talking about the same thing? Is there a phenomenology that's common here from which these terms derive? And then if we get into postmodernism, which, okay, a mutual friend of ours, Tom Hassis, I just saw a post on Facebook at like a 2 a.m. drunk rant saying, about how postmodernism is just a load of shit. But, that was one of the dominant, interpretive frames when I was a graduate student, was this idea of postmodernism, that everything is a construct of culture and nothing really means anything outside of the context in which it is used. And therefore you can't really say anything about anything. And that's postmodernism, I
Yeah,
guess.
it's not super helpful. That's the problem, and that's the problem with most philosophy too.
Yeah.
Does it help you live a better life? Does it give you more intense experiences of the sacred? If not, then like don't fucking waste any time with that. There's better ways to be spending your time, I think.
Yeah.
Just my opinion.
So your time then, just according to the little bio that's at the back of your book, it went into like CrossFit, and you became like an exercise guy. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I spent some time in the video game industry as an animator, and then from there I spent a few years writing and tending bar in New York, and then I got into CrossFit really early in like 2005, and I had a background in group exercise instruction from having done a lot of Muay Thai in San Francisco and teaching at a Muay Thai gym there, and so I ended up opening one and then two CrossFit gyms in Massachusetts, and then applied my video game background to teaching exercise, and wrote a book called By the Numbers, this huge telephone book-sized manual for instructing exercise by breaking everything down into keyframes the way you would as an animator. And then when that came to an end, I moved out to Seattle, and I was basically eagerly clawing my way out of the fitness industry when I crossed paths with ayahuasca, and then high dose mushrooms and phonomancy and the whole bit.
Yeah, and it seems like actually that background fits what you're describing here in the book in a very interesting way. So
Yeah.
if you're doing animating, then you're into like storyboarding and the breaking down of these are the elements and components of the CrossFit training exercise program. This is how they're related to each other. This is how they're structured, and how you move from one level to the next level. That all of that kind of shows up in the book here. And just speaking of animation, so of course this is only audio out on the podcast, but I can only see the top of your shirt, but I know that that is a representation of the first church of David Bowie's Shamanic Cabaret. And there's in Phonomancer there at the bottom, yeah. And you've got
Well,
this.
so it's a parody of the High Priestess card. You know what I mean? From the tarot deck. This would
Yeah.
be Boaz and Joaquin, like the two posts, right? And then it's obviously got Bowie, and then it's got the I think this is from the Ace of Cups, the descending Holy Spirit, and then this is the sigil that I made, Teach Me to Do Magic, David Bowie, that ended up triggering my initial sort of phonomantic breakthrough. And so, as I say in the book, I love a good syncretism. You
Yeah.
know, it's all fair game for new kinds of creativity.
Yeah. So let's kind of walk through the history then. And we're gonna get to the book. We'll get there. But so then kind of re-entering into the world of psychedelics through ayahuasca, through really traditional Shipibo ayahuasca ceremonialism. How was that for you? Getting into that context, which is, of course, is very different than taking LSD on your own and taking some notes.
Oh yeah, hugely different. I mean, the first night on ayahuasca was one of the worst nights of my life. It was absolutely horrible. I was just sort of locked in what I call the holding pattern. I just saw like a single sort of fractal, just like spinning over and over and over again, and then with a really intense sense of like tension and pressure.
Yeah.
But then eventually it ended up being where I sort of broke through to this level where I was seeing you remember when we were growing up before cable, you would have UHF and VHF channels on TV, right?
Yeah.
And in the Boston area where I grew up, we had channels 25, 38, 44, and 56. Those are the UHF channels you could get. So if you were on channel 56, you're watching the Brady Bunch. But if you turned it to channel 55, all you saw was white noise, right? And static.
Yeah.
And what I saw at this point in the journey was an infinite sea of white noise, except every pixel was a soul screaming in loneliness and terror. And like that was the ground of being. Like I was going to drown in it forever. And the only thing that kept me from going completely insane was a willful belief in a God that I knew wasn't there. And I was basically creating from moment to moment. It was so traumatic, so awful. And when it was finally over, the next day I couldn't really speak above a whisper, and I couldn't look anybody in the eye. And I was done. I had originally gone down just for one night just to try it out, And then after talking to people, they suggested that I stay for a second night. And goddamn, if the second night, if I didn't start going into the same sort of like place, and I ended up facing sitting cross-legged, facing my nose a few inches away from the wall of the yurt. It was in this, this big yurt, pretending to be Bodhidharma in the hopes that if I could somehow like channel the Buddha signal, that would keep me from going insane. And then it was this husband and wife team that were facilitating, and the wife called me over, and she's an extraordinary ayahuasquero. She really is. Like the things I've heard and seen her do are just amazing. And she sang me this song that the rest of the songs they were singing were all in Shipibo, but this song was in Spanish, and I understood some of the words like Rosa and Sana, and she's singing a song about roses. And then all of a sudden, just flush through my visionary space, like my eyes were closed. What I was seeing with my eyes closed was the most luscious sort of like lavender pink light, and I could smell roses, and I immediately started to feel better. I had been sitting in front of her just like wilting, like that 200-year-old mummy that's supposedly still sitting in yoga pose. I was like that. I couldn't sit up straight, and then I was like, oh, all of a sudden I could breathe, and I was just like, oh, this is magic. This is like actual literal magic. It's happening to me right now. Holy shit. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, I ended up sitting with them about 34 times. After a while, the husband of the team asked me to start assisting, which just meant like collecting the money and helping people to the bathroom and stuff like that, So I sat with them a lot over the course of just, I don't know, 6 or 7 months or something. And what ended up happening at a certain point was, in ayahuasca, when you do ayahuasca, you've got to enter into that. To get the most out of it, you have to enter into that shamanic reality. They have a certain model for what is happening, right? Like you take the ayahuasca, and as Matt, the ayahuasca, would say, like, the ayahuasca turns on the lights in the operating room, but what's really happening is the plants that they've done diets with that are working through them to heal you, and that's the source of the songs that they sing, right? But you also have the experience of occasionally you feel a presence, a female or maternal presence, and people refer to that as Aya, ayahuasca, Mother Aya talked to me. And at a certain point, Aya told me, so my dad is a married Roman Catholic priest, and my mom is a former nun. And I'm not a Christian. I went to war when I was 12 years old to not be a Christian. Mm-hmm. But Aya told me that if there's a priest gene, you have it. You're a priest from a long line of priests, and you have to find a way to put that into practice. And I was like, well, and at first I thought that meant maybe trying to become, so many people feel called to serve the medicine like
Yeah.
that, like go and sit but I didn't want to do that. I mean, I just didn't, the idea of the celibacy and the austerity that would go into that training was not appealing to me in the slightest. And I honestly, Pake to anybody who's listening, but I'm not attracted to the energetically to the hippie aesthetic, or to the sort of like, or to the trappings of indigenous people and things like that. It's wonderful, and I've definitely benefited greatly from being exposed to that. But I couldn't see myself like being one of those people, so I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that, and that's kind of where matters stood. But actually, I had asked Matt. I was scheduled to do a dieta. I was going to diet Aho Sasha on his property at the end of that summer, a few months away. But I asked him if he could open a social diet for me. Like, he had done his year-long dieta to become an ayahuasquero while living in the States, and his guy in Peru in what's the Iquitos? No, is that the name of the town down there in Peru? Yeah,
Iquitos. Yeah.
Had been willing to do that for him, but I asked the ayahuasquero, and he didn't want to do that for me. So I was kind of at a loss. And then in May of 2017, when I would have been going to sit with them, I had to travel. I had written that exercise instruction manual, and I was doing seminars around the country for it. And so I had to be in Cleveland that weekend when they were going to be sitting with Aya. So instead, I had some mushrooms that had been sitting in the back of my freezer for 6 months, and I decided to do my own little at-home ad hoc ceremony to try to like keep the momentum going, And that was when I sort of stumbled across this phonomantic thing,
Okay,
So.
well, I'm going to pause you there so that we could jump back in at that point. But I just want to point out that I can already see some of the seeds germinating in what you've already described here. So first, going back to that initial ayahuasca experience that was just so horrendous. Just the language that you would be using in the book there is that then this is an example of resistance, where you're kind of at a breaking point and there's resistance to it, and this creates. It's an interesting phenomenon that when somebody resists something in a psychedelic event, in my experience and just in discussions with others, it seems to almost always pick up right where you left off, whatever the next psychedelic is that you take. And so you kind of, if there's resistance, it returns back to that place. And people often describe that as being in a loop, that it's just the same thing over and over again and can't get out. But there's resistance there, so it doesn't allow it to be transformative. But then, as you're describing, that it was actually the words of the Icaro itself that you were able to hear and identify that then blossomed out of the resistance into this very new experience that became, as you say, quote, magical. And this is kind of the process that you're discussing in the book of like bringing yourself to the breaking point with resistance, then pushing through the resistance into the transcendent. And then also, as you've described, as like kind of becoming a helper, that, so again, this reminds me of like going to Santo Daime, where there are roles of guardians, and they are also drinking the daime at the same time. But then their job is to make sure, that people get to the bathroom or that they get a bucket, so that there are roles that they're performing while in the midst of having their own experience with the medicine. And so this is another element that shows up in this phonomantic method that you're describing, and going back to entheotainment.
Yeah. Before we move forward, though, we should clarify something, which is this word resistance and what that concept, how I use that word and what I mean by that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And because in the before I started doing phonomancy and started coming up with these sort of concepts, it had been communicated to me in a subsequent ayahuasca session that what had happened was, because I saw that sort of same ground of being in subsequent experiences, but yet it was filled with life. It was like the most dazzlingly beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And what was communicated to me was that an entity had interpolated itself between me and it, like a filter, and it basically drained all the life from it, so I couldn't see it, and then consequently fed off of my terror. Okay, and so in the Shipibo tradition, that's referred to as shaitana, or spiritual witchcraft, that kind of dark entity, and that's a lot of what um, the ayahuasqueros consider to be their practices. When you sing in front of them, when you sit in front of them and they sing to you, a lot of times they're clearing off the shaitana, the dark entities, and they show up for them as like in various. The ayahuasquero that I worked with always they said that they usually show up for him as bats. He would see them as bats and sometimes like black crawling caterpillars and stuff like that, right? My work, I understand that in the psychedelic community, resistance refers to the and I should maybe like look it up in the book so I don't get this wrong. Refers to the tendency of people to not want to give into the process of letting the Okay, so I'm going to just very briefly read from the book.
Sure.
Resistance is what we're defending against, not resistance as in weight training's progressive resistance, not resistance as the word is usually used in the psychedelic therapy space, meaning a subject's unwillingness to surrender control. In the phonomantic method, resistance with a capital R is a transpersonal force encountered in consciousness that opposes your skillful efforts to achieve short and long-term objectives. It is a profound and terrible no. The term resistance is borrowed from the novelist Stephen Pressfield. In his book, The War of Art, he defines it as a quote-unquote engine of destruction that seeks to defeat human creativity in all domains. The Jungian analyst and storyteller Clarissa Pinkola Estes called it quote-unquote the natural predator of the psyche. My ayahuasquero buddy refers to the phenomenon as shaitana, a Shipibo word meaning spiritual witchcraft. It's been mythologized in Buddhism as Mara and in Christianity as the devil. You might prefer to interpret the phenomena as the emergence of negative emotional complexes. However you conceptualize it, if you do enough work with psychedelics, eventually you'll come up against resistance. And so when I use that term, that's what I mean. It's like this spiritual force that wants to kill you. It wants to kill everything. And the more that you do high dose work, it seems the more that you come to its attention and the more it tries to thwart you. And so a lot of what I end up doing in the course of my work now is getting past that and getting to get to the states where I want to be.
Yeah. And that's really what the whole methodology is about, is even kind of inviting that resistance in order to transcend through it. And going back to sort of the weight training metaphor, that you're building ability and you're gonna hit the wall sooner or later, and then this is about figuring out how to break through the wall while on very high doses of powerful psychedelics, and then performing at an exceptional level that then translates into a greater capacity just for being in everyday life.
It's CrossFit for the spirit. In the sense that you are voluntarily subjecting yourself to high levels of stress while in an altered state of consciousness, because it makes you a better human being across 8 dimensions of self that I define within the book.
Yeah. So let's get back into the trajectory of how this all developed. So then when did you get into experimenting with high dose psilocybin, and I think also sort of ayahuasca with harmaline?
Yeah. Well, what ended up happening was that in May of 2017, when I did that stay home ceremony with the mushrooms, I was like, well, I'll get to use my own playlist. I'll get to use my own music, which is great, And so I made a playlist, and it was like, stuff you would think would be good to trip to, like Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices and Iron and Wine and stuff like that, But then I put on a record album by an indie rock band from the late 1990s called Neutral Milk Hotel. And they had written this album in the airplane over the sea, which is effectively like Jeff Mangum, the guy behind the band, had read The Diary of a Young Girl, the Anne Frank's journals, and had basically like a a complete breakdown over it, and then wrote a whole record about trying to make a time machine to go back in time and save her. And it was one of my favorite albums of all time. It basically saved my life back in 1997. And so I put on that album and was listening to it. And then at a certain point, I did a little hape. I did some Mazzi's Extra, which has some datura in it, and I saw a little, I saw this lovely little scene of like a backyard summertime barbecue with like Japanese lanterns and little kids like waving sparklers. It was so sweet, And then this song "O Comely" came on, and "O Comely" is this. It's just him and Jeff and his guitar, and he sings this dirge about Anne being sent to the camps. And as I was listening to this song, I started to get these really strong images of concentration camps, barbed wire fences and churned and frozen mud and windowless brick buildings. And as I kept listening to it, I started sort of like rocking back and forth in my seat, just sort of almost davening. And then something happened that had never happened to me before on any psychedelic. I started getting these rushes of energy through my body, which, when you hear people talk about that stuff and you're like, yeah, okay, you felt energy. But like when it actually starts to happen to you, you're like, holy fuck, what is happening? But you're feeling this rush of like electrical current through your body. And something told me to sort of like hold on to it, which I did. I sort of bunched my fists and was like, and shaking with the effort to hold the energy. And then when the song reached its climax, spontaneously, I took a big breath and opened my hand and blew the energy in my hand like out into the world, and then did the same with the left and fell back, and sort of had this sense that I had transformed this darkness and this shame and the sorrow that I had been feeling while listening to this song into something beautiful. I turned it into this artifact of exaltation. And at the same time, I had a really strong sense that the mushrooms were like, what was that? What'd you just do? Do that again. and then I started and then for the rest of the night, I just kind of experimented to see like the different aesthetic effects I could get by listening to different songs. And then the next week, I went to talk to a friend of mine about it the next day, and he told me about this a comic book called Phonogram, which is about these. It was from the 90s. It's about these young hip Brits in the 90s who do magic by listening to pop music, and they don't use psychedelics. But they'll listen to like a pulp song and get super hyped up, and then they can do like Harry Potter style magic with it. And they called what they did, they called themselves phonomancers, and their practice was phonomancy. And I was like, yoink! That was like, that's the perfect term for what I'm doing. And then from the next week, I tried it again, except this time it seemed to like, it kind of like crapped out after like less than 2 hours. And I was like, wow, that sucks. Like I didn't get anywhere. But I had read somewhere that if you could smoke some pot and it might like wake it up. And I don't know, I have no idea what possessed me to do this, but I went outside and I took 3 hard hits of pot within like 2 minutes. And when I came back in, that shit hit me like a freight train.
Yeah.
I'd never been through anything like that in my life. I was utterly unprepared for it. And it was absolutely mind blowing, and I mean, and then from there, it was just sort of like, I was staggered, but I held on for dear life. And this is probably a good place. There's one more significant part that I can tell you, but I can pause here if you have any particular questions.
No, I would just kind of reiterate the point that you just made for anybody who really is not aware of it out there, that taking some cannabis tends to greatly augment whatever psychedelic experience you happen to be in at the moment. And yeah, I learned that pretty early on with mushrooms, that because I'd been a cannabis user before starting my experimentation with psilocybin mushrooms, and I was at the point where I thought, okay, the mushrooms are all done, I'm going to have a little cannabis now. And then all of a sudden, oh no, we're right back in the mushrooms. And then you've got a few more hours to go. And so I like to recommend it as generally wait to take any cannabis until you're on the downside, and then be prepared, take a little bit, and then know that you're going to open it all back up, that it becomes this very interesting amplifier. So yeah, I would just reiterate that point, but I'm enjoying the narrative.
Please, anybody out there listening to this, if you haven't done this and you're thinking about experimenting, approach it with great caution, because it can be utterly overwhelming really like world disappearing around you, overwhelming, and yeah, unless you've done high dose IO or smoked DMT, you have got no context for what could happen to you. So just please be careful.
Yeah,
Please be careful.
be pretty surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know what possessed me to do this, but I decided I had dicked around a little bit with chaos magic and specifically sigil magic. And so I decided to sort of combine that with what I was doing. I decided to make a sigil that stood for "Teach me to do magic, David Bowie." And I was gonna, the way sigil magic works is, you write out an intention and you cross out the vowels and the repeating consonants and you arrange the letters into a sort of witchy looking glyph, and then you charge it by concentrating on it in a moment of extremity, whether it's by like, Grant Morrison, the comic book writer, talks about bungee jumping with a sigil in his hand, or you can run around the block until you pass out. And of course, the most common popular method is the wank technique, where you masturbate and at the moment of orgasm, you focus on the sigil. I decided I was going to put my sigil on a computer screen, and at the climactic moment of a song, I was going to concentrate on it with all my might. And that was what I did. I took mushrooms, and I think I was still only working. I think early on I was working with some penis envy mushrooms that were particularly strong and visually potent. But I was working with 4 grams, and I put on I'd made a playlist. I just had like hours of music because I was just experimenting with different stuff to see like what would work, And I put on some David Bowie songs, and during the song Moon Age Daydream, I had the first time in my life, my quote unquote third eye opened up. I saw with my eyes closed a completely 3D lucid dreaming vision. And I saw myself on stage and in front of a crowd of maybe 100 people or more. And I was on mushrooms and they were on mushrooms too. And they were looking up, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking at the sigil projected on the screen behind me. And I realized that this was a sort of like a class. It was an act of ritual magic, but it was also almost like a dance party and a fitness class all in one. And I was leading it. And they were all trying to establish an energetic connection with David Bowie, but not the man David Bowie, but what he had come to represent in the culture, which was the magician, you know what I mean, or the shapeshifter. And in doing so, they were hoping to excite a response, which was exactly what was happening to me in that moment. And more or less all at once, I had the idea for everything I've done for the last 5 years. It all just dropped into my head at once, that I was going to organize these sort of dance parties that were also going to be musical theater, that were also going to be a kind of like group fitness class. And then from there, I just started working it out. And what I noticed was after another couple weeks of experimentation, I was looking at my my playlist one day, and the way I had organized it was I started off with some really lilting, like pretty pop music to sort of soothe the entry into it. And then when I would always get anxious, and so to help myself with the anxiety, I had a bunch of heavy rock stuff, because I found that the aggressiveness of the music kind of helped me work through that. And then when things kind of calmed down, there was a bunch of pop stuff, and so all the rock stuff just happened to feature male vocalists. And then after that, I had a dance party with a bunch of like new wave and funk and classic soul music, and that was almost all female vocalists. And then at the end, there were these songs about Anne Frank. That seemed to be this important thing that needed to be in there. And as I had been realizing that what I was doing and working with these songs, I'd started evolving this idea that psychedelics impacted consciousness music impacted psychedelically altered consciousness in a couple ways. And the first way is the way that we're all familiar with, which you could call the cymatic effect. And cymatics, 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 is the visual representation of vibratory patterns. Like if you take some flour and you spread it on a glass plate and then attach a tone generator to it, the waves of vibration from the tone will spontaneously make the flower particles rearrange themselves to form a geometric pattern. And if you change the tone, the pattern will change too along the nodal lines of vibration. There had been a night when I was sitting with my ayahuasquero where, we're sitting in the pitch black in the Maloka, and I'm sitting a couple feet away from him. I can't see anything, although my eyes are wide open. But as he starts singing to me, this pattern starts to form in the air between us, and it's really like, it looks technological and it's animated. And then all of a sudden I realized that it is almost exactly like one of the designs in the Shipibo textiles that are hanging in the Maloka.
Yeah.
And I had heard that the Icaros that people sing, that the practitioners sing, are taught to them by the plants. And so as he was singing this plant song, its energetic signature was manifesting in the air before me. And I realized, oh, he's cymatically vibrating my consciousness with this song. And you can put on all kinds of music will somehow stimulates the field of consciousness and excites a sort of a visual response. But then I realized that what was even more powerful was, and it only apparently so far it only really works on mushrooms. It didn't work on LSD. I tried it with LSD. Is the mushrooms amplify your emotional states, but your emotional states also affect the way the effect of the psychedelic manifests in your consciousness. In other words, what you're feeling influences what you see. And so every song that you can listen to, especially pop songs, they're kind of carefully engineered to create a specific kind of emotional response. And if you really get into that emotional response really strongly, it changes what you see in your consciousness, right? And so I realized like each of these songs that I was working with had a kind of target emotion. And as I was looking at my playlist, I realized that if I took each of those songs as having as representing a target emotion, the sequencing of those target emotions basically matched the contours of the hero's journey, in the sense that it started like at a sort of a neutral, sort of like kind of easy place, and then moved up through this place of wonder, and then gradually started darker and darker and darker and darker until things got really bad, and then came out the other side into this place of great sort of like wonder in homecoming, and all the rock songs, all the male rock songs did that. And then so did all the female songs. And then the 4 songs from the Neutral Milk Hotel record, if I considered that starting with the ordeal, followed the same pattern. And that was something that was utterly unplanned and spontaneous. And it really gave me like this frisson of like, what the fuck, And then once I realized that, I realized like, oh, this could be theater. You could follow this you could make up a story that indicates each of the sort of emotional targets and go through this thing and have this shared experience with other people. And so,
yeah. And just to point out some of the things that you mentioned in the book, that this is obviously very different than sort of the standard protocol that is now being developed in sort of the psychedelic therapeutical context of the idea of, well, we're presenting music that generally is instrumental, that doesn't have lyrical content. And I think that there's been sort of a strong emphasis on nothing that's too challenging, that more soothing sounds and pleasant experiences. And, I enjoy music like that. But I've never done anything along the lines of what you describe in the book here. But in some parallels, I like to commit to a playlist. And often for me, I'm listening to my own music, which I know you've sampled a little bit of, but my own music, it goes through a lot of different sounds and a lot of different, it's not lyrical, but there are different emotional resonances. And I commit to that I'm going to listen to this playlist all the way through, even when there might be elements that like, oh, this is really uncomfortable, or the way that this guitar sounds right now is really just kind of like, oh, but I've committed to it. And this idea that actually I like the use of music as a sonic driver, both for the cymatic effects that you're discussing, as well as the emotional content that it triggers, and then also the energetic reactions that it triggers in the body, and how that is then processed through as visionary states or as the arising of emotional content. And that I do think that having a wide mix of music, some that is soothing, some that is challenging, some that is slow, some that is fast, is actually really important in order to kind of access all these different areas of the self as you're going through your experience. And also, somewhat in parallel, something that my wife and I used to do, this is before our son was born, he's 9 now, but we actually did this for a couple of years, where we were doing this at least a few nights a week. We called it DMT Dance Party, where, we'd get a playlist together and, we'd pack the bowl with some cannabis and some DMT. And the idea was, as soon as you want a little more, just go take a hit. And the goal is we're dancing all the way through. and we're gonna kind of keep moving, keep going. And then if you need to lie down for a bit, you do that. But when you're ready, then you're up, you take another hit, and you keep dancing. And yeah, we call that DMT dance party. And it would, we'd draw it out for several hours.
Yeah.
So some similar themes. Of course, yours is
Yeah.
much more organized and much more targeted. But that's one of the things that I enjoyed in reading your book, is like, oh yeah, this kind of reminds me of this aspect of my own sort of approach to working with these things.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the idea is, the heroes, one of the reasons, so for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the hero's journey is this sort of template that seems to underlie all kinds of myths from around the world. Joseph Campbell was famous for popularizing this idea, but it's also become very popular in Hollywood because people use it to pattern their screenplays because it reliably produces an experience of catharsis. It builds a great deal of emotional tension and then which results in a release. And when you experience strong emotional catharsis in a highly altered psychedelic state, all kinds of interesting things can happen. You know what I mean? And that's something that just having a playlist that just kind of goes from end to end doesn't really accomplish. You know what I mean? And that's also where you do it multiple times and sort of like doing it with a bunch of masculine music and have a catharsis, and then a bunch of feminine music and then have a catharsis, and then do it with this sort of like rite of atonement, and in the end it ends in the giant catharsis for the whole thing. It's the structure that creates a deeply coherent experience, and the coherence to me is one way that you can and when you repeat that over and over again, you get better at it and get deeper experiences out of it each time.
Yeah, and significantly that you're not working with instrumental music. This is lyrical music, and the lyrics are extremely important for the process that you're cultivating here.
That said, you can work with instrumental music too. Like one of the highlights of my night when I do these ceremonies is the second part, the feminine part, which I call the transcendental disco, is introduced with Richard Strauss's tone poem, also Sprach Zarathustra, which is the music from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that one, as long as like all things being equal, that can put me like over the moon, where my eyes are completely rolled back in my head, like I'm in a complete theta wave state, just from that, But yeah, I think that working with lyrically based music is really interesting because you can repurpose the lyrics to mean something different than what they originally meant to do. I mean, it works at multiple levels, right? You are challenging yourself to remember the lyrics while you are in that state, right? That's where it starts. And then the next state is to train yourself to sing at least well enough that you can perform this kind of do you know the term ekagata? In Buddhism, like one pointed concentration.
Okay, yes.
Yep, right. And so you can actually do this neat bit of neural remapping where you can be listening so intently to the music at a volume where you're singing along, but you map what you're hearing onto your proprioceptive sense of what your vocal apparatus is doing. So you actually experience yourself as singing. Like that's your voice on the recording. It's coming, like you're doing it, but you hear that as yours. And that becomes this way to completely become, well, you reach this state of yogic complete absorption. And that again drops you into deeper and deeper levels of the of transpersonal consciousness. That's kind of what you're shooting for, right? And you're also getting the cymatic effect of you're singing along, so you're getting vibrations all through your skull and everything, which you can't really get at the same level from just passively listening to instrumental music.
Yeah, and what I think is also interesting about using lyrical music is that kind of, as you say, that often in listening to a song on the radio or just casually listening, the words might seem to have a rather straightforward meaning or a singular meaning. But once we get into psychedelic states, like this is something that people approach me with sometimes is like, well, I had this experience and like, what does it mean? And what I usually like to explore with them is like, once we're dealing with these psychedelic states, there is no one singular meaning.
Yeah.
There's actually everything means everything that it possibly can mean.
Yeah.
And sort of this fractal relationship, right?
And also, what do you want it to mean? Because it can mean exactly what you want it to mean in that moment. You know what I mean? And if you want it to mean a magical, there's a passage in the book where I don't know if you read the narrative description of working with the song Umbrella by Rihanna, where the Paul Mercury, who is the phonomancer who's leading this ceremony, is he does this neat sort of trick where when he starts working with that song, he's singing along to it, and but he's listening to it, and Rihanna in the song is singing to a you, we're worlds apart and blah blah blah, whatever the lyrics are, right? And so she's singing to a you, and he imagines that he is the you that she's singing to, right? And then he imagines that it is the goddess that is singing, and so and that because he's in this extremely heightened psychedelic state and he's concentrating so hard, that becomes his subjective experience. It's like the music becomes a carrier wave for a new level of information. It's the goddess herself that is singing to him, and the reason that she is because he experiences that way. He feels it in his heart and feels that incredible, like, oh my god, oh my god. And then later he takes it even further, where by singing along with it, he identifies as the goddess, and then basically performs darshan on stage in front of people, and becomes the goddess in her guise as Gaia, like and has an experience of what I call enthusiasm, which is this really sort of like paranormal experience. It's actually what happened in that initial phonomantic experience, that experience of rush of energy through the body, but it's so much stronger. And it basically like bends you over backwards. And it's actually looking at, I watched your video talking about your non-dual fractal yoga, and sort of being taken over in that space. You know what I mean? It's not the same thing, but it's that kind of thing where you are surrendering yourself to that energy. Another parallel could probably be drawn to Loa possession in voodoo practice. You know what I mean? Where you're basically surrendering to the goddess and allowing her to pass through you as an act of ecstatic worship.
Yeah, and that was actually something I was going to ask you. I was just curious if you'd had the chance to experience 5-MeO DMT, because there are a lot of parallels, but of course it's much more compressed. It's happening in a very short period of time, and it's not anything that anybody can intentionally direct. Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's these spontaneous events that take place.
It comes at her grace. It comes by God's grace. You know what I mean? All you can do is sort of set the stage for it and kind of constellate all these aspects of your consciousness to try to be ready to receive it. But whether or not it comes is entirely up to her.
Yeah. Yeah. So then in developing this first on your own, experimenting with the playlist, and then kind of having the epiphany of, I'm recreating the hero's journey. And again, for anybody who's not familiar with it, well, just go watch the first Star Wars, and then you know what it is, because George Lucas read all of Joseph Campbell, and he's like, okay, this is how we're going to make the movie. And that's really where it started to enter into popular culture. And now we can see like countless movies following the same archetypal format.
And screenwriting manuals that specifically reference the hero's journey. Like, here's how you write a good screenplay. Use the hero's journey.
Yeah. So you archetypally kind of stumbled into it. I mean, here again, it's like, it's not really a coincidence that you're dealing with sort of these very primal energies and powers and personal experience. So, well, of course, the same basic map and blueprint is going to show up, so as, these coincidences, these synchronicities. So then how did you move from, okay, I'm doing this on my own and man, I'm having a really trippy time and really interested in this, to now this idea of the cabaret, of bringing in other people and having performance and stages and lighting, and all while under heroic and super heroic doses of mushrooms. So how did you get from just you and your playlist to the cabaret?
Well, I mean, I was having these intense experiences, and then I needed to know if I could do this in front of other people. And so what I did was I started renting a studio space in Seattle in like a band rehearsal complex, because I knew I needed it to be loud enough. It needed to basically be at nightclub volume, and I needed someplace where we could go and do that, And the first time I did that was almost a fucking disaster. There's I've got a memoir too. It's called If you can see that, it's called Spotify the Gnostics. Here's the first Church of David Bowie, and if you recognize the Nevermind the Bollocks Sex Pistols parody of the cover, right? There's a chapter in there called Haunted House, which explains like what happens when you go out into the world and you have no idea how to protect yourself from evil entities or anything, and you do something like this. It was really. I lived out the dictum: if you're gonna be dumb, you better be tough. You know? But anyway, after that, I rented a permanent space, and what I did was it was this small space, just maybe like a dozen feet by a dozen feet, and I built out half of it as this sort of creche. I built this cage of PVC pipes, like little skinny PVC pipes, and hung it with like black drapes, and put up all these Christmas lights and stuff like that. And I had some ideas for costumes, like that I was going to I was going to wear costumes in at certain points and stuff. And I invited a couple friends down, and we went through it. And at this point, what I had was the playlist and these costumes, but not much else. And when we got to the point where I started the what I call the stereo, so another word for the hero's journey is the monomyth. And so the first part of this, the rock part of my show was called the stereo myth.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so it was a time for the first song, and I knew it was going to be the Spirit of Radio by Rush, which is this like AOR staple from the early 1980s, you know. And it's the feeling it was supposed to evoke was this sort of like youthful abandon and naivete, but also sort of nostalgia, you know. And because it was like the Fool. You know, it was like the first, or the hero in the everyday world would be the hero's journey stage, right? But the archetype would be the Fool. And I realized, I didn't explain to my friends that this is what they're supposed to be trying to feel while they listen to this song. And I was like, what am I going to do? And so I started making up a story, and I just said out of the blue, I said, your name is Ged, because that's the name of the bass player, Geddy Lee. I said, your name is Ged. You're 22 years old. You're from Erie, Pennsylvania. And you started to think you've made some bad decisions in life. And I outlined this story about this kid who's like, he's stuck in this little town because he didn't want to leave home because his little brother was living with his alcoholic mom. He didn't want to leave him alone with her. And so he's working at Jiffy Lube, and he's really started to despair. And the only bright spot in his life is when he goes 2 towns over to this bookstore where there's a girl that works that he's got a crush on. And once again, he doesn't ask her out, and he gets in his car and he's totally dejected. And as he pulls out onto the road, he turns on the radio, and this song comes on, and he remembers, this was one of his dad's favorite songs. He loves this song too. And so he cranks it up and starts singing along. And then I was like, and that feeling sounds a lot like this song. And then they got it, you know? Yeah. And then I spontaneously improvised chapters in between each song that made up a story about this kid driving along a country road and then his car stalling. And then he basically gets kidnapped by Ziggy Stardust in the form of a 7-foot-tall alien aboard a triangular flying saucer, where he's brought to another planet where he has to find the means to save the world from imminent nuclear catastrophe. And so he goes on this quest on this alien planet and finds what he needs and then comes back, you know? And so then when that was done, I had to do the same thing with the transcendental disco part. I just made up a story on the spot. But all those bits actually made it into the show. And eventually what I ended up doing was, so over the course of 2 years in Seattle, I did this about 24 times. I would invite people down, and I had a little bit more of the show in place each time. And I was also learning the skills that I needed to perform, because I was like walking out in front of them and trying to, like, at first I was just extemporizing on the story. I was trying to tell the story without a script while I was on 5 grams of mushrooms, you know what I mean, and pot and stuff. And sometimes it went better than others. But it started to take shape, you know, until eventually I got it to the point where when I moved down to Portland, I did it twice in Portland in front of big crowds, like 50 to 60 people. But it was just like me alone on stage as a proof of concept on 5 grams of Solowaska. So it was 5 grams of cubensis plus a water extract of 3 grams of Syrian rue seeds plus 2 or 3 hits of pot to prove that I could walk on stage, perform, change costumes in the dark in 2 minutes, in 2-minute segments, while like the recorded version of the stories were being told, while running light shows on cue and stuff, and dealing with the energies in the room, because you're in a shamanic reality, right? You're in an unconstrained when you do ayahuasca, they put a lot of work into like locking down the maloca energetically. You know what I mean? They'd clear it out with tobacco smoke, and they'd burn different kinds of like incense and stuff like that, and they would bless the space and everything. I was just in a rented room in a warehouse, and which made me extremely vulnerable. And the first time actually went pretty great. It went pretty great, even though I was literally like just on my own. I had a friend who was supposed to be helping me find my costumes and stuff, and he was useless. I mean, I'm sorry, Dave, but you were kind of useless. And it was, but I got through it. And then what happened was the second time, a few months later, I had this huge breakthrough. I had done this thing where it was still being run off of a Spotify playlist, and I had for each of the story sections, I had an audio file that would play, right? And somebody pointed out to me, oh, it seems like people were having a hard time like paying attention between songs when you weren't on stage, because I would walk off stage because most of the time I'd be changing costume, right? Mm-hmm. And my friend was like, why are you running it off of Spotify? Why don't you just make it into one QuickTime movie? Because I also had sigils on a screen, so I was running PowerPoint on a separate screen, and I'd have to remember to like advance the PowerPoint slide in between songs while I was super high on mushrooms and doing all the other shit that I was doing. And I was like, well, that's brilliant. Why don't I do that? And so I took all my songs and I laid them into I got Adobe Premiere, and I made a big movie file, and I put in all the songs, and then I put in all the sigils that I was using. But then I was like, well, why don't I actually make music videos for each of these songs? And because then I could have images that would help condition the aesthetic experience of that people are supposed to be having, right? And I also recorded myself on video reading the story. So in between songs, there I was in my Pa Dammit costume. Pa Dammit is my sort of like my shamanic superhero guy, right? And Pa Dammit wears a black Roman clerical shirt, like a priest shirt, except he's got an electric blue, a blue LED dog collar for a collar. He's got this glowing blue collar. And so I made these music videos, and it was like a huge hit at this next show. Like I said, there were maybe 50 or 60 people had come down they had no idea what they were coming in for. It was, to them, was just this weird rock and roll good time. The First Church of David Bowie's Shamanic Cabaret. I'm down for that, and they were into it and everything until the end, because at the end in the Anne Frank working, that song, "O Comely," climaxes with actual images from the camps of corpses, like stacked. You know what I mean? And I had done nothing to prepare these people, and most of these people were not on the medicine. They were just there as like looky-loos, right? But I had done nothing to prepare them for that, and they all walked out. Almost like probably 95% of the audience walked out after that, and I was left on stage to finish up for the last 15 minutes, like in that state, dealing with that. I mean, think about if you're a musician, you imagine you're playing a set, right? And then you've got 2 songs left, and all of a sudden everybody just walks out. You'd be like, fuck, right? Yeah. And so that's what happened to me, except that I was on 5 grams of ayahuasca and 3 hits of pot. And that was a little traumatic, And at that point, I had one more show scheduled, but that was when the pandemic hit. And so everything has been off the books for the last couple years. And in that time, I realized what I need to do is the only way I can really do this again in public is I have to recruit, what's described in the book, a full crew of other supporting people who are in it with me. So that if something like that happens again, then at least we'll have each other and to sort of defend ourselves against and to be in it together. You know what I mean? Because that's ultimately what it comes down to is the doses that you can do, that I would do this on, are half of what I would do privately. Like when I want to do hard visionary work on my own, I've pushed it up to 10 grams plus 3 grams of Syrian rue plus multiple hits of pot plus vape DMT. That's a state where like the only reason I have any idea what happens in that time is because I do the entire thing on video. And I narrate in between songs, like, here's what I saw. And I'm at a point now where even on a dose like that, I maintain this level of lucidity and clarity. The problem is, while I'm speaking, you wouldn't know that I'm on a dose like that. The problem is that afterwards, I have absolutely no memory of it, and so that's why it's necessary to do it on video so I can reconstruct the experience afterwards. But that's not the level that I'm working at when I do this with the in a performance context, because that's about creating an experience for everybody, right? That's the ideal, is that you are trying to model for the participants how to do what you're asking them to do. And in that sense, it's like a group fitness class. You're like a yoga instructor or a soul cycle instructor or something, right? You're up there showing them how to do the work and giving them somebody to be like, oh, this is how I perform these. Because essentially with each song, you're performing a psycho-spiritual exercise on multiple levels. You're dancing, you're singing along, you're trying to get into the emotional space of the song. And then a lot of times you're also conducting some sort of psychological self-inquiry. Like if you're working with the Tool song 46 and 2, you're actually being like, you're closing your eyes and saying, show me what I don't want to know about myself. Because you are actually trying to make contact with your Jungian shadow and bring up contents along those lines. And most of the songs have some sort of high level associated exercise that you can be doing as well.
Yeah, so maybe that can get us into what are the fruits of doing this. And just to kind of preface, I'm sure some people are listening to this and they're just kind of like, what the fuck? I mean, this sounds like fucking crazy. But just to kind of tease some of the things that you talk about is kind of getting into that state where accepting that what you are experiencing is real but not literal. And a distinction that you make in the book that also reminds me of things that I've said is, like, when we look at ancient mythology or, religious doctrine, that one of the things I pointed out is like, well, back then they didn't really have these different categories of literature the way that we do now. Now we can clearly label something. This is fantasy. This is sci-fi.
Yeah.
And that we kind of have this literal approach to religious mythology, but I don't think that that's really the way that it's supposed to be understood. Because if we take it literally, it's total nonsense. But if we take it as sort of that Joseph Campbell model, that this is archetypal, that represents different stages of human development and the cultivation of a full person. Therefore, it's real, but not literal. In the same way that we can look at Star Wars and we can say, well, look, Star Wars is obviously not literally true, but the themes and the dynamics and the emotional range that you go through as you experience Star Wars as a fan, that's real.
The experience, that the thrill that you feel when the Death Star explodes and you're like, yeah, that's real. You know what I mean? That's that kind of, when you have an experience like that on a high dose of psychedelics and your visionary space interprets that with a vision of the goddess, that's a real experience of it. You can't take it literally, and yet you can. It's so. I've been playing with this. God, this is one of my favorite topics, and it's what I've been thinking about a lot lately. Right? In the past, religious people who had these types of intense experiences were working within an enclosed culture. They had their belief system in place. They had their symbols that they used to interpret these experiences, right? And they were entirely culturally determined. You know what I mean? Like if you had an experience of the divine feminine, if you were a Hindu, you saw Durga, and if you were a 17th century French Catholic, you saw Mother Mary. That's what you saw, right? Because you're encountering these literally unthinkable and inconceivable energies, and it's like your imagination is spontaneously throwing up the most elastic kind of representation it can generate, which is a symbol, right? An image. But we live in a period where we no longer we've seen the collision of all these things. We've seen them all. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you've been exposed to the great religious texts around the world and their mythical ideas, which makes it much more difficult to take any of them as being literally true. You know, now you have a distance, but what that implies is this idea of what I've been calling a para-reality game. And a para-reality game is sort of it's based on this idea that says it's in AP Psych in the section on faith, and it says so I'll try to get through this quickly, is engaging in engaging in participation mystique with the apocalyptic mythos of the shamanic cabaret while in ceremony is tremendously beneficial to your phonomantic efforts. Continuing to play that game outside of ceremony is the key to the phonomantic method's efficacy as a vehicle for personal transformation. In other words, the cabaret is a game of make-believe that can yield real-world results. But guess what? So is every religion. Watch now as I proceed to offend about 93% of the world. There is no real evidence to support Houston's conviction of disclosed truth for any religion's claims except for the experiences of adherents who, whether by inherited tradition, proselytization, or earnest searching, have been introduced to a story and made the decision, conscious or not, to believe it is true. Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days. That's a story. The Quran is based on revelation received by Muhammad from the Archangel Gabriel. That's a story. Siddhartha Gautama achieved perfect Buddhahood by sitting under the Bodhi tree for 49 days. That's a story too. Modern scholarship indicates it's very unlikely the accounts we have were recorded by eyewitnesses. So do these stories describe events as they actually happened? Are they really true? Until someone invents a time machine, there's just no way to know for sure. As Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Lacking that, perhaps the best we can say is that they are quasi-fictional. They are imaginally true. And that's all they need to be. And that's what modern religion has to be now, and I'm just going to finish this one more paragraph. The phonomantic method and its entheotainments set chemically induced religious experiences in the context of a new kind of faith that is no less earnest or life-changing for being self-aware that it is quasi-fictional. It's a game that becomes reality the moment it puts you up close and personal with a goddess. And then there's a Latin epigram, credo quia iocis et quia operator, which means I believe because it's fun and because it works. Yeah. And that's the approach I think that we need to take to this stuff now is like we need a story to interpret these experiences, but we have to know that it's a story that we're making up. But what that means is we can make up new stories and we don't have to continuously keep trying to bend over backwards to make what we're experiencing now fit these old categories and these older experiences. We can push things in a new and more innovational direction.
Yeah, and it's very liberating. To kind of use the language that you're using here in the book is that the problem with ancient religions that we're still hanging on to today is that adherents are not willing to admit that they're playing a game.
Yes.
Or that they're interacting with, in a sense of make-believe, and we're all taking it literally, and then, oh, you don't believe the right thing, so we've got to inquisition you, and we've got to kill you, and we've got to bomb you. But it's actually very liberating and even playful to acknowledge, like, look, it's all a game. And that's one of my little catchphrases that I like to use is like, the game is the thing. It's like reality is God's game. And then you might say reality is the goddess's game. But, and I'm not going for gendered God by saying that. But anyway, I say reality is God's game. And the game is the thing. It's not about winning. It's not about losing. It's not about any of these things. The game itself is the thing. And so if we consciously participate in that with that sense of play and being willing to go through the difficult parts of the game, because just because something's a game doesn't mean it's always easy or not going to be painful.
That makes it a good game.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's got to be tough. There's got to be challenges to overcome, you know?
Yeah.
The only thing that's real here is the divine or the sacred, which can be experienced variously as void or matrix or person. Any story that we tell about it is going to be necessarily incomplete. It's just sort of like, what story do you want it to tell? What do you want God to be? God will be that for you. You know, I just happen to be really into God as person and specifically God as female person, which is why I work a lot with goddess stuff. But I also work with God as the horned god. You know what I mean? Like Cernunnos and Shiva and like in aspects like that, because I totally get off on that energy as well. I always think about this stuff as like your belief system is like a stained glass window that you hold up to the rays of the rising sun, and spirit is like the light passing through it and bringing it to life for you. And you can have different images in that stained glass window. You know, you're not beholden to any one thing. And what's so beautiful about the idea of entheotainments is that every one is a portrait of the divine the way the artist or the artists who created it understand it. And so if you participate in different entheotainments, and the first Church of David Bowie Shamanic Cabaret is just the working prototype of an entheotainment, but I would fully expect that other people, once they understand this concept, will pick it up and run with it. And then I can go to their shows and see God through their eyes and learn something new. you know?
Yeah. And without the literalist attachment, going back to the stained glass window metaphor, you can have your window, you can even change it out if you want, and there's no
Yeah.
need for you to go smashing other people's
No,
windows
fuck no,
or
no,
for them to come smash yours, which
no.
is how religions have operated.
Yes.
We
But we
don't,
can grow up now. We can leave that in the past
yeah.
and admit nobody's got a lock on truth. It's all a matter of taste. Like what it's just like loving bands. How can you we were talking about the Cure earlier, like, and you can love the
Yeah.
Cure, but somebody else might hate the Cure, but they can't tell us we're wrong for loving the Cure. It's just what we like. You know what I mean? But I also like Mastodon. You know what I mean? Like I like that too. You know what I mean? Like I like Prince. I like a huge gamut of different stuff, and any one of those things somebody else might not like that, but I they can't tell me that's wrong. Just like I can't tell them they're wrong for liking, I don't know, Depeche Mode or something like that. You know what I mean? It's all just a matter of taste.
Yeah. And even through exposure, I mean, okay, so we mentioned the Cure. I remember the first time I heard the Cure, like my sister was a year older than me, and so she had the Top, which is a pretty obscure Cure album. But anyway, I listened to it and I was like, God, that dude just sounds like he's in pain all the time.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to listen to that. But then I kind of got more into it, and then I really realized, kind of going back to the play thing, is like, this guy Robert Smith, he's just playing the whole time.
Yeah.
That he's actually more of a clown than actually this depressed, morose person. That there's a playfulness there that then kind of came out in later records.
Yeah.
Fried Am in Love or whatever. But it's interesting how tastes and appreciation can change as you become more familiar with it and you kind of expand your creative horizons. And that kind of gets me to this point of creativity, that all of this sounds like it's been a very creative process for you. I know that for myself, I love being engaged in creativity, that sometimes I call myself someone who is compulsively creative, because it's almost an addiction, that I love it. I like to participate. I like to do new things and create. And this sounds like this has been very gratifying for you, that the whole thing actually it's kind of an art project.
Yeah.
But with this really serious intent of generating deep spiritual, mystical experiences that can transform you as a person, to go into the image that you use in the book of you become a line that bends. And if we get into, sort of this fractal nature of being, that you don't just want to be a straight line, but actually the more edges you can produce, then the more complex shapes you can create, and the more iterations you can create across different dimensions of yourself, that's really what you're getting at here.
I am. And perhaps even actually the thing that's the most important thing is the fact that this is a way that you can come together with other people and have a similar experience. Virtually anything that you can enjoy by yourself can be amplified by doing it with somebody else. And I believe that's going to be true of the mystical experiences that psychedelics can produce. But in order for that to happen, in order for you to be able to come together with other people and sort of be on the same page and have a similar experience, you're going to need two things. The first is easily understandable activities that you can perform together. And then the second thing is you need to be able to keep your shit together, so that if you start to have any kind of difficulty, it's not going to become somebody else's problem. You know what I mean? Like, you need to have that kind of basic self-control. And that's what the point of the phonomantic method is by going through, it's to train up that self-control, but it's also to provide an ordeal, frankly, an amazingly fun and life-changing ordeal that you can go with other people and achieve a sense of communitas, right? A sense of bonding, because you've been through something together. And then even better, there's a reason, now you have a reason to get together, because now you can get together, work on your singing, work on your dancing, meditate together, like do all these things. And that's what, more than ever, that's what our society needs.
Yeah. And I think probably something that a lot of people who listen to my podcast could probably easily access and understand and appreciate is that it kind of reminds me of Burning Man, in the sense that Burning Man is a lot of fun, but it's also one hell of an ordeal. You have to work really hard to go to Burning Man and enjoy Burning Man, and then you're exposed to all these energies and all this stuff, and you can have catharsis after catharsis there. And, I should put the addendum, it's been like over 10 years since I've been to Burning Man. So I don't know what it's like today. So it's kind of dated, but it kind of reminds me of that. It's sort of compressed into the shamanic cabaret of like, we're
Yeah.
going to go through this really intense thing and we're going to pack it full of these potentially highly meaningful, yet also creative and playful elements. And some of it might be very challenging and others will be very pleasant, but it's got this structure and that group sense of, wow, we did it together.
Together.
Yeah.
Yeah. We went through this together. That's kind of where the CrossFit influence comes in, because like, one of the things that turned people on CrossFit, I don't like where it's ended up, but in the early days, it was this very pure thing where you got together and then you did these tremendously hard workouts that were often really painful. But you did them alongside other people. And the ordeal turned out to be a good deal because it brought a sense of comradeship, of bonding. And I watched in my gyms, I watched all kinds of people make all kinds of new relationships, and, they got divorced and they got married and they had kids, and like, it was life-changing for them because they had this thing in common, and I would love to see some kind of psychedelic practice that can provide that with people. I'm a little, until that kinds of happens, there's always the chance that we're going to all disappear into our individual psychedelic towers of Babel.
Yeah.
If everybody's just having, and it's not to say that like you can't attend an entheatainment and then also go to a daime thing and then also like sit on 5 grams in silent darkness. You can continue to do your own things, but it's just like seek out ways to work with other people, and support each other.
Yeah, and I think part of the appeal of this model that you're proposing here is that while it's archetypal and structural in nature, it's not dogmatic in nature. And, for me, that was one of the turnoffs of the Santo Daime Church, is that they do have a very strong doctrine. And I wouldn't say that they ever tried to push it on me in any way, but it's pretty much always present. And this is something that was fascinating for me in attending Santo Daime ceremonies. Since you mentioned about singing the songs and really identifying with the content of the lyrics and the songs, that this was a very curious phenomenon that occurred within me. So you're singing in Portuguese, and these little hymnals, they would have the English on one side and the Portuguese on the other, and you're singing in Portuguese, and there'd be times where I found I simply could not sing the song, and then I'd look at the English translation. And based on my own interpretation of reality, I'd be reading these lyrics and my reaction was, oh, well, this is wrong. And therefore I couldn't sing the song, but I couldn't sing the song before I actually saw the translation. And then there were other songs where it was just like effortless. And then I'd read the English translation. It's like, oh yeah, I'm in alignment with these words here. And so that's the limitation of the dogmatic structure, that is going to alienate some and will resonate with others. But if we're working in a more creative, expressive context that is not doctrinally based, I think it makes it more accessible to a broader spectrum of people. And as you say, I do think that we need to rebuild community, that's become a major issue in American culture right now, that we are so divided into very dogmatic communities, and there's no cross communication or cross pollination or conversation. And so everything seems to be more and more atomized and more isolated. And so, yeah, if we could do First Church of David Bowie Shamanic Cabaret, and if that helps bring people together and generate powerful experiences that are transformative and integrated into people's lives in a meaningful way, hey, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and I mean, I honestly think that the only way forward for us, for American society, is a kind of societal reboot at a spiritual level, and that is going to come from giving people an upfront, a direct and immediate experience of transpersonal reality.
Yeah.
And that can look a lot of different ways. I mean, have you ever heard of Beyonce Mass? Do you know what that is?
No.
Beyonce Mass was this event that was first held at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and now it's like an ongoing event. It's a regular Christian Episcopal Mass, but they use all Beyonce songs in between the parts, and so people sing and dance along to Beyonce. And if you put those people on mushrooms, that would be an entheatainment.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's people will look at my, as eclectic as my playlist is. Some people are just like, well, I don't like that kind of music, and like, that's fine. You'll find your own. It's just kind of like we're energetically drawn to the stuff that we like for a reason. And the reason we will go to, say, like a club where they're playing a certain kind of music is because we know we'll meet other people who are sort of energetically like us, you know? And so maybe somebody who doesn't like some of the hard rock or some of the, I don't know what you couldn't like about like Prince and Debbie Harry and stuff like that, but maybe somebody they just don't like pop music. Like I use a Katy Perry song, Firework, that's like super frothy pop song, and some people are just like, I hate pop music, I'm not going to listen to that. Well, that's fine. If you want to do this, then go make one based entirely on reggae and blues, and you'll attract other people who only want to do that, and I'll go to it because I like that music. I'm open-minded enough to go to that, you know. And that's the thing about it. This can be this idea can work with so many different kinds of music and so many different kinds of people. The only thing that really matters is that you create catharsis by taking people through a real journey. You know, it's not like raves are all like here. It's all about ecstatic joy all the way across. Yeah. You have to take people up and then bring them down so they confront their shadow and have an ordeal, and then bring them out the other side. That's what creates the meaningfulness of the experience. And if you can figure out how to do that with Beyonce, or if you can figure out how to do that with Bob Marley, then awesome.
Yeah. And I guess that seems like a good place to kind of wrap it up. And it brings us right back to your book, AP Psychedelics, Going Beyond Set and Setting to Achieve Visionary Virtuosity by Sean Manseau. This is the guidebook.
Yeah. Well, it's a good, I would say that it's like a survey. You know what I mean? It lays out all the principles behind it, and it gives a little bit of the background of the development of it. I'm working on another book right now called Phonomancer, which is basically like it's like a player's handbook. You know what I mean? Like as if entheotainments are, if you want to talk about it as a para-reality game. A para-reality game, right, is basically a kind of role-playing game that you do in order to that enables and conditions an experience of the sacred while creating the community in which those experiences can be anchored. And so I'm basically, hopefully, that between those two books, that will really fill out the conceptual approach, and people can either I want to say that all the music videos for the First Church of David Bowie Shamanic Cabaret are on YouTube. So if people are if you look up First Church of David Bowie as a YouTube channel, you'll find the playlist for it. And what I suggest you're doing is reviewing the material first, like watching the videos and understand everything that's going to be included. Because what it does is it puts you in a highly suggestible state of mind, and then there's some metaphysical teaching about the nature of the soul and different stuff like that, you know what I mean? And I want people I don't want anybody to feel like they're being drawn into something. I want them to be utterly okay with what they're going to be exposed to, and if so, like, give it a shot and then let me know how it goes.
Yeah. So do you have a central hub online where people can find your books and find links to the videos and things? Or?
It's not quite centralized. If on the back of the book there's popularpsionics.com is the links to my two books on the subject, and then firstchurchofdavidbowie.com is my sort of catch-all of. It's not very well organized. There's a lot of essays. There's a lot of raw transcriptions from ceremonies. Like I'll go through and like type up every single thing that I said and then just post it more or less for potential historical interest at some point, you know, if this ends up being like kind of being anything. Between those things and the YouTube channel, that's pretty much my online presence. I don't really do social media at this point. I find it pernicious and dangerous. Although at some point, I'm sure if I really want to like promote these ideas, I'm going to have to do that. But in the meantime, I'm just going to write these books and talk to people and see what happens from there.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it's really been quite interesting, and I just want to wish you the best for your continuing flowering of your priestly creativity and personal transformation and community building.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right.